Winston Churchill by Thomas Winkelmann. Churchill's family. Winston Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874. At that time, horse-drawn carriages filled London streets. Inventions such as electric lights, automobiles, and airplanes lived only in the minds of scientists. In 1874, Britain was the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world. At the top of British society lived such people as Churchill's parents, Randolph and Jeanette Churchill. Jeanette Jerome Churchill was born in the United States. She grew up in a very wealthy New York family. When she was a teenager, she and her sisters went to school in France. In 1874, she married Randolph Churchill. Randolph Churchill studied law and history at Oxford University, and later served in Britain's Parliament. Parliament is Britain's legislative branch. Churchill held other public offices, including Chancellor of the Exchequer, or head of Britain's Treasury. His son Winston would one day hold the same office. Churchill's education. Starting when he was only 7 years old, Winston Churchill lived at boarding school. He only went home for holidays, and sometimes on the weekends. Churchill was lonely at school. He often wrote to his parents, asking them to visit, but they rarely saw him. He spent more time with his nanny, Mrs. Everest. Churchill went to different schools before he went to Harrow, near London. Although Churchill disliked team sports, he did well at swimming and fencing. He also began writing for the school newspaper. He discovered a love of history. He studied kings, generals, and famous battles. Churchill would remember these lessons years later as Britain's prime minister and wartime leader. Churchill in the military. Churchill's father thought that young men should become priests, politicians, or military officers. His son seemed to him well prepared for a career in the military. Churchill's boyhood interests and talents made him a natural fit for the army. In the fall of 1893, Churchill became an officer cadet at Sandhurst, Britain's Royal Military Academy. Cadets are students at a military school, learn military history, geography, and military strategy. They also practice leadership and other skills required by military officers. After graduation, Churchill joined the cavalry regiment of his choice. The months following his graduation were difficult. His father, as well as his nanny, Mrs. Everest, died. At the age of 21, Churchill felt alone in the world. Churchill then sailed to Cuba as a war reporter for a London newspaper. The Cubans were fighting for independence from Spain. Churchill learned about independence movements and the effects they had on people. Churchill returned to Britain in time to go to India and Afghanistan with his regiment. Afterward, he wrote a book called The Story of the Malaccan Field Force. In it, he described the horrors of battle. He also admitted that war could be exciting. He wrote, "I found that there is nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at without result." Churchill's early career. In 1899, Churchill left the military to run for Parliament. He lost the election, but that did not stop him. He traveled to South Africa to report on the Boer War, in which Dutch farmers, called Boers, fought to maintain independence from Britain. The battles taught him about the methods used by guerrillas and commandos, or small groups of soldiers who move quickly and carry out surprise attacks. Churchill realized that small groups of well-trained soldiers could cause a great number of casualties against a large military force. During World War II, he would remember this lesson. Under his leadership, the British Army would form many such groups. Some commando groups helped train and supply freedom fighters in countries controlled by the Germans. British commandos set an example for other countries to follow. After he returned from Africa, Churchill was finally elected to a seat in Parliament. In 1908, he married Clementine Hozier. He called his proposal to her the greatest speech he ever made. During this time, he also learned to fly a plane. Since the 1870s, Europe had mostly been at peace. However, Germany had become a very powerful nation. Churchill worried that a European war might break out. He knew that once mobilization took place, the army could be built up very quickly. It would take far longer, however, to build up Britain's navy. Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, giving him the chance to improve his country's navy. In that same year, France and Germany almost went to war. As France's ally, Britain would have to take that country's side when war did come. The Great War. As World War I drew near, feelings of nationalism grew in Europe. People had strong feelings for their own countries, but some countries wanted to continue building colonial empires. Other countries tried to control failing empires. A member of the Serbian group that opposed the Austro-Hungarian Empire killed Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife on June 28, 1914. Austria declared war on Serbia as a result of the killings. This event caused many countries to declare war on each other. Britain entered the war to help France and to try to help Belgium, which Germany had invaded. Just as Churchill had feared, the Great War had begun. In August 1914, the German army raced towards Paris. British troops crossed the English Channel to help France. When the two sides met, many battles were fought. As the days turned into weeks, each side dug trenches. Before long, systems of trenches stretched from the Belgian coast all the way to Switzerland. Military leaders faced a new type of war: trench warfare. In 1915, Churchill helped plan the invasion of Gallipoli in Turkey. However, at Gallipoli, the British had no trenches in which to hide. The British and their allies suffered thousands of casualties before returning home in defeat. News of the loss caused Winston Churchill to resign as First Lord of the Admiralty. He rejoined the army and went to France. When the United States entered the war in 1917, Germany and its allies had fewer troops. Germany also had other problems to face. Its citizens did not have enough food, and the government was unstable. Germany had to give up fighting and agreed to an armistice. November 11th, 1918, was named Armistice Day. Later, on June 28, 1919, a formal peace treaty called the Treaty of Versailles was signed. World War II. After 1918, the British people did not want to think about war anymore. Churchill still saw danger in the world that he could not ignore. He worried about the communist government in Russia. Churchill worried that communism would spread outside of Russia. In Germany, there was great unrest. The country had been forced to pay reparations after the war, and its economy faced many problems. These conditions made Germans wish for a strong leader. They wanted someone who could make their lives better. The choice of the German people was Adolf Hitler and his party, the Nazis. Hitler began to build up Germany's military even though the Treaty of Versailles did not allow it. He then sent troops into the Rhineland, where no German troops were allowed. Churchill knew that war would come again. However, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain could only think of peace. Chamberlain wanted to follow a policy of appeasement. In order to avoid war, Chamberlain would allow Hitler to do what he wanted. In 1938, Chamberlain let Hitler annex Austria. Then Chamberlain signed the Munich Pact, an agreement that gave Hitler part of Czechoslovakia. Churchill knew that appeasement would not prevent war. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. At that time, Churchill was given his old job back as First Lord of the Admiralty. On May 10, 1940, Chamberlain resigned, and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. Hitler found that he could not conquer Britain and invaded the Soviet Union instead. Britain still needed help to fight against Hitler. President Roosevelt wanted to help the British, but the American people did not want to go to war. The United States was still neutral. Roosevelt created a program called Lend-Lease. He sent supplies to the British and the Soviets. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was followed by a German declaration of war against the United States on December 11th. The United States went to war. Finally, Britain would have the help that it needed. Throughout the war, Churchill talked with Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Together, they planned their actions. They also discussed what to do after the war. Churchill feared that the Communists would soon try to create an empire. As soon as the Germans had been defeated, the Soviet Union began to take control of Eastern and Central Europe. When the war ended in 1945, Churchill worried about the future. During a visit to the United States in 1946, he made a speech warning the audience of the Iron Curtain that had fallen across Europe, meaning the territory that the Soviet Union now controlled. This territory stretched from the Soviet Union all the way to Eastern Germany. In each country they controlled, the Soviets put a harsh government in place. As a member of Parliament, Churchill worked to expand the role of the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. He knew that the world needed protection from communism and other threats. Awards and honors. In 1953, Queen Elizabeth II made Churchill a knight. Sir Winston Churchill also won the Nobel Prize that year. The Nobel Committee awarded him the prize for literature. By then, he had written 40 books. Churchill's first term as Prime Minister ended in 1945. He again served as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955. After 1955, he continued to serve in Parliament. For the next 9 years, Churchill spent time with his family, traveled, wrote, and painted. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy awarded him with an honorary United States citizenship. Churchill retired from Parliament in 1964. That same year, a girl in Mexico City sent a card to Churchill in honor of his 90th birthday. She did not know his address, so she wrote, "The greatest man in the world," on the envelope. Churchill received the card. Winston Churchill died on January 24, 1965, exactly 70 years after his father's death. He's remembered for his words and deeds as a man who would never surrender in the fight for freedom.